I was 16 when it happened. It was one of those humid summer nights when the air feels thick and the crickets never shut up. My best friend, Jake, and I had this stupid tradition. We'd sneak out, walk through the woods behind my neighborhood, and meet up at this abandoned park on the other side. It wasn't anything special, just a rusted swing set and a broken down slide, but it felt like our place. That night, I was feeling uneasy before I even left. My parents had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was dead silent. Still, I cracked my window open, slid out, and hit the ground as quietly as I could. The second my feet touched the grass, I felt it. That weird skin-crawling feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off. Probably just my imagination. The woods were pitch black, the moon barely peeking through the trees. My phone's flashlight wasn't much help, but I knew the trail by heart. Twigs snapped under my sneakers, and the damp smell of dirt filled my nose. I told myself I was alone. Halfway through, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't behind me. They were ahead, just off the path. Slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Jake," I whispered. Silence. I took a step forward, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But then, the footsteps moved, closer, circling to my right. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the trees, a figure stood motionless. It wasn't Jake. I could barely make out the shape. Tall, lanky, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a head tilted slightly, like it was watching me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body locked up. My breath felt too loud, like it was the only sound in the entire forest. Then, the figure moved. Not toward me, not away. It just shifted. A single, unnatural step to the side, like it was testing how I'd react. My body finally caught up with my brain. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. I wasn't even on the path anymore. I didn't care. I ran until I saw the dim glow of the streetlights near the park. Jake was already there, sitting on the swing, scrolling through his phone like nothing was wrong. "Dude, what the hell?" I panted, doubling over. He looked up, confused. "What?" I spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The woods were still, like they had been all along. "You didn't see anyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake frowned. "Number, I've been here for like 10 minutes. What are you talking about?" I wanted to tell him everything, but saying it out loud would make it real. So I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. We hung out for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. When it was time to head back, Jake offered to walk me home, but I lied and said I'd take the longer way around the streets. There was no way in hell I was going back through those woods. I barely slept that night. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the spot where I saw the figure. The leaves were disturbed, like someone had been standing there. But the worst part, there were footprints, not just any footprints, bare feet. Long, twisted impressions in the dirt, leading deeper into the forest. I never snuck out again. I was 17 when this happened. It was the summer before junior year, and like most teenagers, I hated being stuck at home. My parents were strict, the type to lock every door and check on me at night, but that never stopped me from sneaking out, at least not until that night. It was a Friday, around 1 a.m. My best friend Jake and I had made plans to meet up at a park a couple miles from my house. The only way out was my bedroom window, so I quietly slid it open, climbed onto the roof, and dropped down into the backyard. The air was thick with humidity, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. I made my way through the neighborhood, sticking to the shadows. The streets were dead. No cars, no people, just the occasional porch light. I remember feeling that weird kind of thrill you get when you're doing something you shouldn't. But that feeling didn't last long. As I was cutting through an alley to save time, I noticed something. At the far end of the alley, standing under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there perfectly still. I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was watching me. I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but I told myself I was being paranoid and kept walking, keeping my head down. As I passed, I stole a quick glance over my shoulder. He hadn't moved. I picked up my pace. By the time I got to the park, I'd almost shaken the uneasy feeling. Jake was already there, sitting on the swings, scrolling through his phone. "Dude, you look like you saw a ghost," he joked. I laughed it off and told him about the guy in the alley. He shrugged. Probably just some drunk or a homeless dude. "It's late." I nodded, but something in my gut told me that wasn't it. We hung out for about an hour before deciding to call it a night. As we left the park, I had this gnawing feeling of being watched again. I glanced around, but there was no one. Still, I felt it. Jake and I split up at the intersection near my neighborhood. He lived in the opposite direction, so I was on my own. The streets were too quiet now. No crickets, no distant cars, just silence. Then, as I turned onto my street, my stomach dropped. The man from the alley was standing in my driveway. He was facing my house, his back to me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I should have run, should have called someone, but I just stood there frozen. Then, slowly, he turned his head. Not his whole body, just his head, like something out of a horror movie. That's when I saw his face. His eyes were too wide, like he had no eyelids. His mouth was stretched into this horrible grin, showing way too many teeth. His skin looked wrong, like it didn't fit his face properly. He lifted a hand and beckoned me forward. Every instinct in me screamed, "Run," but my legs wouldn't move. Then he took a step toward me. That snapped me out of it. I bolted. I didn't care how much noise I made. I ran straight to my backyard, climbed the fence, and scrambled up to my window, my hands shaking so bad I almost fell. I barely managed to get inside before slamming the window shut and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I peeked through the blinds. He was standing in my backyard now. He shouldn't have been able to get there that fast. It was impossible. I backed away from the window, heart hammering. My phone was still in my pocket, but I was too scared to move. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I worked up the nerve to look again. He was gone. I barely slept that night. Every little sound made my skin crawl. But morning eventually came, and when I finally stepped outside, everything seemed normal. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I never told my parents, never told Jake, but I never snuck out again. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel like someone's watching me. I was 14 the first time I snuck out. It was stupid, I know. But at the time, it felt thrilling, like I was doing something rebellious without any real consequences. My best friend Jake had convinced me to meet him at the abandoned playground on the outskirts of town around 1 a.m. He had a pack of cigarettes, and we thought we were so cool, hanging out where no one could see us. I told my parents I was going to bed early, locked my door, and waited until the house was completely silent. Slipping out through my window was easier than I thought. My house was a one-story, and my room faced the backyard, so all I had to do was drop down onto the grass. No big deal. The walk to the playground was quiet, too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. The streets were empty, the houses dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Jake was already waiting on one of the rusted swings when I got there. The place had been shut down years ago, the wooden play structure rotting, the metal chains on the swings creaking with every movement. "Dude, you took forever," Jake whispered, tossing me a cigarette. I wasn't even a smoker, but I took it anyway, playing along. We sat there for a while, talking about school, girls, the usual stuff. But the whole time, I felt uneasy. The street lights nearby flickered, casting weird shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Then, out of nowhere, Jake froze. His eyes locked onto something behind me. "What?" I asked, my heart already starting to race. He didn't answer. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty road, the overgrown bushes, the abandoned buildings in the distance. But then, movement. Someone was standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dark. I could only make out the shape of a person, tall, unmoving, just watching. I turned back to Jake. "Do you see that?" He nodded, his breath shallow. "Let's get out of here." Neither of us hesitated. We got up and started walking back toward our neighborhood, not daring to look back. But we weren't alone. I could hear it, the sound of footsteps, not running, not even walking at a normal pace, just slow, deliberate steps, as if whoever was following us knew we were terrified and was enjoying it. "Jake," I whispered, but he already knew. "Don't look, just keep walking," he muttered. We picked up the pace. The footsteps behind us did too. My house wasn't far, just a few blocks away. If we could just make it. A sound cut through the silence, a low, raspy chuckle. It was coming from right behind us. I lost it. I sprinted. I didn't care about staying quiet anymore. Didn't care if my parents caught me sneaking in. I just ran. Jake was right beside me, breathing hard, his face full of panic. We turned the corner onto my street, my house in sight, and that's when I made the mistake of looking back. There was no one there, just the empty road, the dim glow of the street lights, the wind rustling the trees. But I knew what I heard. Jake and I didn't say a word as I scrambled back through my window, locking it behind me. He texted me a few minutes later. "You heard it too, right?" I replied. "Yeah." Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, I checked the local news. There was nothing about anyone being out that late. No reports of strange figures. Nothing. It was like it never happened. But I swear, to this day, sometimes when I'm walking alone at night, I hear it. That slow, deliberate footstep. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I hear the chuckle.